The living room door burst open and I flinched, spinning around. Standing before me was Ethan, his bloodshot eyes and tense face creating an atmosphere so thick it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. He didn't say a word at first, he just stared at me. But that look alone was enough to make my entire world crumble beneath my feet. "Do you think I don't know?" His voice finally broke the silence, low but trembling with suppressed rage. His words cut through me like a blade, leaving me feeling like I was free-falling into a bottomless abyss. I took a step back, clenching my palms. "Ethan, what are you talking about? I don't understand." I tried to keep my voice calm, but the tremble in every word betrayed me. "Stop lying, can you just stop?" He stepped closer, his gaze burning into mine. "Do you think I didn't see the way you looked at him? Do you think I couldn't feel it every time he touched you?" I froze. His words, though simple, peeled away every layer of emotion I had tried so hard to bury. The mask I had been wearing for so long shattered, leaving me exposed, standing there stripped bare in front of the truth we both knew but had been too afraid to confront. "Ethan, you're misunderstanding." I managed to choke out weakly, but he cut me off before I could finish. "Don't. I don't want your explanations." His voice cracked, his shoulders trembling. "I just want to know why. Why me? Why did it have to come to this?" I couldn't answer him. Not because I had nothing to say, but because any words I uttered would only make things worse. I stood there, staring at him, guilt and regret clawing at my chest. Outside, the sound of rain pattered softly, blending with the storm raging inside me. I knew in that moment there was no turning back. What had happened between us could never be erased, and the truth was dragging us both into a vortex we couldn't escape. I sat quietly in the living room, my eyes gazing out the window where raindrops clung to the glass. The silence in the room was deafening, but inside my head, memories played like a slow-motion film, rewinding to the days I first met Ethan and Daniel, two men who had turned my life upside down forever. Daniel was the first to enter my life, like a gentle breeze. He was the perfect man any woman could dream of, successful, composed, and always attentive to others. We met at an art seminar, and I was immediately drawn to his charm and wit. Within months, we were in a committed relationship, and a year later, we got married. However, marriage wasn't the fairy tale I had envisioned. Daniel's career consumed him. The once loving moments faded into silence, brief conversations, and nights he came home late. I tried to convince myself it was just a phase, that I needed to be patient. But over time, the loneliness and emptiness grew stronger. Ethan, Daniel's son from his previous marriage, entered our lives during a sweltering summer. He had just finished his sophomore year of college and moved in with us to save money. I still remember our first meeting. A tall, broad-shouldered young man with a slightly awkward smile. Daniel introduced him with pride, and I made every effort to make a good impression. At first, my relationship with Ethan was unremarkable. I treated him like a younger brother, and he kept a polite but distant demeanor. But as Daniel's business trips became more frequent, Ethan and I spent more time together. We began talking more, about trivial daily matters and deeply personal issues I had never shared with anyone, not even Daniel. I began to see Ethan as more than just a young man figuring out his life. He was deeper than I had imagined, hiding thoughts and feelings behind his calm exterior. On quiet afternoons on the porch, he would talk about his strained relationship with his mother, his childhood, and the pain he had carried for years. His voice, warm yet filled with hurt, revealed a young man who felt lost, belonging nowhere. His words struck a chord within me. They reflected my own struggles, a woman searching for connection and solace that I couldn't find in my marriage. I can't pinpoint when everything began to change. Perhaps it was the first time our eyes lingered on each other longer than they should have, or the fleeting touch of his hand as he handed me a glass of water. I tried to convince myself that these feelings were a mistake, a byproduct of prolonged loneliness. But the more time passed, the more I realized I couldn't ignore the emotions surging within me. Ethan was no longer just my husband's son. He was the only person who made me feel truly seen and understood. One evening, while Daniel was away on a business trip, Ethan and I were cleaning up after dinner. I was washing dishes, and he was wiping the table. It was a fleeting moment, but it carried so much weight when I turned and caught him looking at me. His eyes held all the emotions we had never spoken of. I didn't know why I stood frozen under his gaze, but I knew in that instant that everything between us had shifted. Ethan stepped closer, as if he couldn't resist the invisible force pulling us together. But then, as if held back by an invisible thread, he stopped, took a deep breath, and turned away. "You should get some rest," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. I nodded, but inside, a storm raged. Those memories replayed in my mind over and over, a haunting reminder of how I had let things spiral out of control. I couldn't stop thinking about Ethan's gaze, about the way he made me feel like the only woman in the world. Yet I knew that if I didn't put an end to it, I would destroy everything, my marriage, my family, and myself. And then came that fateful night, when all the emotions we had been suppressing exploded like an unstoppable storm. That night, the house was quieter than ever. Daniel hadn't returned from his extended business trip, and I sat silently on the sofa, a glass of red wine in hand, my eyes unfocused as I stared at the flames dancing in the fireplace. The soft glow from the table lamp cast a warm but melancholic atmosphere. I tried to lose myself in a book, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Ethan. When did these feelings begin? When did his gaze, his voice, start to have such a profound effect on me? My hands trembled as I set the glass down on the table, unable to steady myself. Suddenly, I heard footsteps coming from the hallway. Ethan appeared, dressed simply in a t-shirt and jeans, his hair slightly tousled, and his eyes catching the dim light. He stopped in his tracks when he saw me, looking a bit surprised. "You're still awake?" he asked, his voice deep, carrying a hint of concern. "I couldn't sleep," I replied, trying to sound casual. "What about you? Is something wrong?" "I heard the fire crackling and thought you might still be up," he said, stepping into the room. "I didn't want you to sit here alone." His simple words caught me off guard. Maybe this was what I needed, someone's presence, someone to share the feelings I had kept bottled up for so long. I smiled faintly, motioning for him to sit down. Ethan settled into the chair across from me, his eyes never leaving mine. "Are you okay? You've seemed different lately," he said, his tone sincere. I took a deep breath, unsure how to respond. "I've just been thinking about a lot of things," I said, struggling to articulate the truth. "Sometimes I feel like I don't really belong in this house." He was quiet for a moment, his eyes reflecting an understanding I didn't expect. "I know that feeling," he said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "I've felt that way so many times." I looked at him, surprised by his admission. "Really? You always seem so strong and confident. I never imagined you felt that way." He gave a small, bittersweet smile. "Everyone has their moments of weakness they don't want others to see, don't they?" His words struck a chord deep within me. I couldn't stop myself from saying the things I had buried for so long. "I feel like I don't truly belong here," I said, my voice trembling. "Daniel is a good man, but there's something missing between us, something that used to be there but isn't anymore." Ethan met my gaze, his eyes locking with mine. "I understand that," he said, his voice quieter now. "There are some relationships where, no matter how hard you try, there's a gap that can't be bridged." The space between us grew heavy with tension, but also connection. I felt as if Ethan could see right through me, understanding the things I hadn't dared to say out loud. And then, an unexpected moment unfolded. The lights flickered and went out, plunging the house into darkness. "Probably a power outage," I said, trying to break the silence. Ethan got up to find a flashlight. When he returned, the dim beam illuminated his face, creating a scene that felt both familiar and unfamiliar. In the shadows, everything blurred, but his eyes were clearer than ever. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft but filled with concern. "I'm fine," I replied, though my voice quivered. I wasn't fine. My heart raced and my breaths grew shallow. Ethan moved closer, placing the flashlight on the table, its faint light falling over both of us. He began but stopped, as if wrestling with his thoughts. "I don't want you to feel alone." His words pierced through me. I knew I needed to stop this, that if I didn't, things would spiral out of control. But his eyes, the way he looked at me with such sincerity and longing, rendered me speechless. He leaned in, the distance between us shrinking with every second. I felt his breath, warm and close. I knew I only had to take a step back, say a word, and everything would stop. But I didn't. I just stood there, letting my emotions overpower my reason. When his lips met mine, it wasn't a gentle kiss. It was raw, filled with all the emotions we had suppressed, desire, pain, and the turmoil neither of us could deny. The world around us faded away, leaving only the two of us in that fleeting moment. But then, the shrill ring of a phone echoed from the hallway, snapping us back to reality. I pulled away, guilt crashing over me like a tidal wave. Ethan stepped back as well, his eyes filled with regret and anguish. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice shaky. "I shouldn't have—" I cut him off. "Ethan, we can't do this," I said, my voice breaking. "This is a mistake, a terrible mistake." He nodded, his eyes betraying his pain. "I know," he said before turning and walking away, leaving me standing there, feeling as if my entire world had just collapsed. I knew everything had changed forever, and there was no going back to the way things were. But I also knew that if I didn't make a decision now, I would destroy everything, my marriage, my family, and myself. The ringing of the phone from the hallway jolted both of us back to reality. I stepped back, feeling as though I'd just woken up from a mesmerizing but dangerous dream. Ethan's eyes locked with mine for a moment, carrying all the emotions we couldn't express: longing, anguish, and the turmoil that seemed to bind us together in an oppressive silence. I wasn't sure who looked away first, but when Ethan turned and walked out of the room, closing the door behind him, it felt like the entire world had been sealed off outside. I sank into the chair, my trembling hands resting on the table, trying to steady my breathing. But before I could fully gather myself, my phone buzzed on the table, Daniel's name lighting up the screen. My heart clenched. I picked up, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's me," Daniel said, his voice warm and familiar as always. "I'm coming home earlier than expected. I'll be there in about 2 hours. 2 hours. Time seemed to rush at me like a tidal wave. I knew that if Daniel sensed anything was amiss, everything would fall apart. I had to sort this out. I had to end this dangerous, ambiguous connection with Ethan immediately. But how could I face him after what had just happened? When Daniel arrived, he walked in with a bright smile and a bouquet of flowers for me. "I missed you," he said, setting the flowers on the table and pulling me into a hug. I stood motionless as he embraced me, a wave of guilt surging through me like a relentless tide. Dinner was strained. Daniel chatted cheerfully about the highlights of his business trip, but I couldn't focus. My eyes kept darting to the empty chair at the dining table, Ethan's chair. He wasn't there tonight, and I felt like I was waiting for something to happen, something I knew would change everything forever. And then it did. Around midnight, after Daniel had gone to bed, I heard a noise from outside. My heart pounded as I stepped out into the dimly lit yard. Ethan stood there under the faint glow of the porch light, his face a mixture of determination and deep pain. "Ethan, what are you doing here at this hour?" I asked, my voice small and shaky. "I couldn't leave without saying this," he said, stepping closer. "I can't just stay silent and pretend none of this happened." "There's nothing more to say," I interrupted, trying to keep my distance. This will destroy everything." "You think I don't know that?" he shot back, his voice louder, brimming with emotion. "You think I don't understand that this could tear everything apart? But you also know, just as I do, that we can't deny what's happened between us." His words tore through the air like a thunderclap. I stood there, unable to refute him, because deep down I knew he was right. I felt it too, the connection we couldn't ignore, no matter how much we tried. "I can't hurt Daniel," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I made a vow to protect this family, and I can't destroy it for something fleeting." Ethan looked at me, his eyes filled with anguish. "Then tell me you feel nothing," he said, his voice soft but laced with a quiet challenge. "Look me in the eyes and tell me this was all a mistake." I wanted to say it. I wanted to deny everything, but the words caught in my throat. Ethan stepped closer, and I could feel his breath, warm and steady. "You can't say it, can you?" he whispered, his voice trembling. At that moment, a noise came from the doorway. We both turned, startled, and there stood Daniel. His eyes were dark as they moved between the two of us, filled with unspoken questions. The tension between the three of us was suffocating. "What's going on here?" Daniel asked, his voice calm but chillingly controlled. I felt frozen, unable to speak. Ethan dropped his gaze, his shoulders slumping. "It's nothing, Daniel," he said, his voice resigned. "I just wanted to say goodbye before I left." Daniel's eyes bore into me, filled with doubt and suspicion. I knew that no matter how reasonable Ethan's explanation sounded, Daniel had sensed that something was deeply wrong. And in that moment, I realized I couldn't run from this anymore. I had to face the truth, the choices I had made, and the consequences that were bound to follow. That tense moment in the yard lingered in my mind as I stood face to face with Daniel in the living room. The space between us felt heavier than it ever had. His eyes were filled with doubt, pain, and disappointment, like he was trying to piece together a puzzle he didn't want to see completed. Ethan had left shortly after, leaving me with an indescribable sense of dread. I knew that from this moment forward, any attempt to lie would be pointless. The truth, no matter how much I wanted to hide it, always had a way of surfacing. Daniel sat down on the couch, crossing his arms, his piercing gaze demanding an explanation I wasn't sure I could give. "Anna," he began, his voice low and deliberate, each word laden with weight. "Tell me what's going on. All of it." I couldn't look him in the eye. My gaze darted around the room, searching for an anchor, but everything in the house seemed to accuse me. Finally, I sighed, realizing there was no way out. "Daniel," I said, my voice trembling, "I've made a mistake." He didn't respond, but the silence was worse than any words he could have spoken. I continued, each word like a blade slicing into my own heart. I let my emotions cross a line. I can't deny that there's been a connection between me and Ethan, one that should never have happened. Daniel leaned back in his seat, as if my words had drained every ounce of strength from him. "I knew," he said, his voice heavy with resignation, not relief. I felt something wasn't right, but I didn't want to believe it. His admission broke me. Tears streamed down my face. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice cracking. "I didn't know how to stop it. I never wanted to hurt you." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a pain I knew I could never forgive myself for causing. "But you did," he said, his voice shaking. "You've broken everything we built, and now I don't know if there's any way to fix it." I wanted to reach out, to hold him, to apologize in the most heartfelt way I could, but I knew my remorse wouldn't be enough. Daniel deserved better than this. The next day, Ethan left the house. There was no goodbye, no indication he'd ever been there. All that remained was a gaping void in my chest, a void I knew I would have to learn to live with. Daniel, though he stayed, became a distant figure. The warmth between us turned to cold detachment. Dinners were silent, conversations were half-hearted, every moment a consequence of the choices I had made. But the story didn't end there. A month later, Daniel surprised me by suggesting we go out to dinner. It was the first time since the incident that he'd initiated anything to break the tension. I thought maybe he was ready to forgive me, or at least trying to. But as we sat down at the table, he looked at me with a resolve I had never seen before. "Anna," he said, his voice calm but steely, "I want us to separate." I froze, the words hitting me like a blow. "Daniel, you can't do this," I stammered. "We can get through this. I know we can." He shook his head, his eyes unwavering. "This isn't what I want, but it's what I need to do. I can't live every day knowing the person I love betrayed me. And the worst part is, I'm not sure if you truly love me, or if you're just holding on to something that's already gone." His words were the final knife, cutting away any hope I had left. I knew he was right. Though I loved Daniel, my betrayal had shattered the foundation of our relationship. There was nothing left to salvage. As I packed my things and left the home we once called ours, I felt like I had lost everything. But at the same time, I understood this was the price I had to pay. Ethan was no longer in my life. Daniel was no longer in my life. All I had left was myself, and a painful lesson about what happens when you let emotions override reason. This ending wasn't clean. It wasn't about forgiveness or healing, but it was the truth, and it was the only thing I could accept.